What if I told you one of the Bible's most iconic prophecies? Ezekiel 38 and 39, the war of Gog and Magog, might be unfolding before our eyes, and that it will be triggered by something surprising, by peace, not by conflict. When we announced that the tribulation likely started on the Feast of Trumpets, back on October 2nd and 3rd, 2024, we got all kinds of questions from our viewers. Many of those centered on the Gog of Magog war. The question would go like this. I've always heard Gog of Magog was supposed to happen before the start of a tribulation. So this can't be the tribulation, right? Well, I've heard that comment, that Gog of Magog happens before the tribulation as well. But if you read Ezekiel 38, 10 through 11, it says this. Thus says the Lord God, on that day thoughts will come into your mind, and he's speaking to Gog, and you will devise an evil scheme and say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will fall upon the quiet people who dwell securely, all of them dwelling without walls and having no bars or gates. So let me ask you, how in the world does that square with what is currently happening in Israel? Not at all, right? It's just the opposite. Israel is a nation at war. The Gog of Magog alliance can't invade Israel. However, until this very key prophetic passage is fulfilled, Israel must be a quiet people who dwell securely. Obviously, this is the opposite of what Israel is like today. Israel is at greater peril and has greater sense of watchfulness than at any time since they became a nation in 1948. Yet, Gog of Magog doesn't happen until they're dwelling securely. So peace is going to be the trigger for Gog of Magog. Yet, if you look at YouTube or you look at the news, you'll see that the nations that are found in the Gog of Magog alliance are currently assembling themselves against Israel. And that is important. And yes, these could be the same ones predicted thousands of years ago in the scriptures as the Gog of Magog alliance. But the bottom line is the invasion cannot happen till Israel is at peace. And it is highly unlikely that that's going to occur until we have some sort of peace treaty. No matter how many foes Israel defeats, they won't defeat enough to be at peace, truly at peace, and be able to let their guard down. This is Bible teacher Nelson Walters, and today we're looking at how that happens and the events that lead to the Gog of Magog invasion, and also the timetable that takes us from the peace to Jesus' glorious victory over Israel's enemies. So we figure this peace is going to take an event of prophetic proportions in order for Israel to think they are dwelling securely. And that event, in our opinion, is the enforcement of Daniel's covenant from Daniel 9:27, a false peace that Israel feels forced to accept. And that's what we're spending our time on today, because it's where we are. Hey, folks, we're living this right now. And there are 3 reasons this will very likely happen in the next 6 months. First, and most important of all, Trump is now the president of the USA. If you remember, Trump started the 2-state solution ball rolling 5 years ago with the famous deal of the century. And Trump doesn't like to lose. And the biggest thing that he didn't accomplish his first time around was the 2-state solution. And he's starting to get things rolling already. As soon as he won, he told Netanyahu to end the wars with the Hammies and the Hezis before he was inaugurated. Second is the death of the Palestinian leaders like Yahya Sinwar, who were opposing the deal. Now, there's no one left from that side opposing it. Only Israel is opposing it. This brings up point 3, the international alliance. On the Feast of Trumpets this year, a 90-nation alliance formed to use the power given them by the new Pact for the Future to force this 2-state solution on Israel. Since they formed just a month and a half ago, they've met 2 times already, and just today the International Court issued warrants for the arrest of Netanyahu and Gallant as war criminals. This is one more piece of pressure to force this on Israel. So for all these reasons, in the last month, the enforcement of the covenant has picked up almost unstoppable steam. And once the peace treaty is signed, the end times are just going to kick into high gear, including making Israel believe that they're able to become a nation of unwalled villages. This makes the Gog of Magog war possible. And I know some of you are out there saying, hey, wait a minute, stop talking about now. Isn't Gog of Magog 1,000 years in the future, as we see in Revelation 20? So before we talk about now, I agree. Let's talk about that distant future for a minute or two. The Bible has two major references to these names, Gog and Magog, not just in Ezekiel 38 and 39, but also in Revelation 20. And a lot of you are thinking right now and pointing out to us that the holy people are at peace in that Revelation 20 situation as well. At that time, Gog and Magog appear again, but this time at the end of 1,000-year millennium, after Satan is released from the bottomless pit to deceive the nations one final time. Let's look at that passage in Revelation 20, 7 through 10. And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea, and they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. Now, many say this is the only fulfillment of Ezekiel 38 and 39. But why? Why can't there be two fulfillments of this prophecy at different points in time, one during the lead up to Christ's return and one at the very end of the millennium? But they could both share this common name, Gog and Magog. Both, after all, would be massive rebellions against God and the people he loves. That and the region the attacks come from is why the attack after the millennium is also called Gog and Magog. It's going to be like the first one. And notice in Revelation 20, it's Gog and Magog. But in Ezekiel 38, it's Gog of Magog. So they seem to be somewhat differentiated. But that's probably not enough for you to see that they're different. And if you still think the one fulfillment is in the far future, and that's the only fulfillment, think of this verse from Ezekiel 39:7, upon the victory of Jesus. And my holy name I will make known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let my holy name be profaned anymore. And the nations shall know that I am the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. Do you realize that this cannot refer to Revelation 20? Because at that point, after 1,000-year millennial reign, Jesus was ruling in Israel and over the whole world in the millennium. How could Israel only know his name after this battle then? Same thing with the nations who already knew he was the Lord, but came after him anyway. So we just had to take a moment to discuss this because I know many of you need to hear what I just said first. But since we now know that there are two events with the name Gog of Magog, one prior to Jesus' return and a future one at the end of the millennium, in both cases, Israel has to be at peace and living in safety before the attack happens. And this in turn requires a false peace covenant now, exactly what the international alliance headed by Saudi Arabia is trying to do, to divide the land of Israel and create a Palestinian state and end what they call the occupation by Israel. And they're doing it on behalf of a hidden and unknown he. There is a he doing this. We just don't know who he is yet. If this truly is the first year of the tribulation, that false peace covenant should take place then sometime prior to the Feast of Trumpets next year, 2025. All during this first year of the 70th week of Daniel or the tribulation. That's how we'll know what we've been proposing truly was the beginning of a tribulation. And if we're correct about Daniel 9:27, 3.5 years from now, in the spring of 2028, we know a major invasion of Israel is going to take place, according to Jesus in Luke 21:20-24, in a passage that mirrors the abomination of desolation passage of Matthew 24:15-21. Jesus says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart. And let not those who are out in the country enter it. For these are the days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written. Alas, for women who are pregnant, and those who are nursing infants in those days. For there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled." Notice how this passage has the same desolation as Matthew 24, the same fleeing to the mountains, the same concern for women and infants. Many of the verses are near direct quotes. It's the same event. But in this version, it also shows armies surrounding Jerusalem at that time. This is the beginning of the Gog of Magog war, in our opinion. Gog of Magog is the breaking of the false peace covenant and the invasion of Israel by the Antichrist forces. So let's start with a timeline and begin applying other prophetic Bible verses to it. At the beginning of the timeline, we have the covenant. The covenant was made prior to the tribulation, began to be enforced on the first day of the tribulation. That's Daniel 9:27. And the two-state solution is probably still, 5-6 months away. That's where the peace covenant will come in. Isaiah 28:14-15 can be applied here. The covenant with death and Sheol. As well as Ezekiel 13:10 about the prophets who cry peace when there is no peace. It will still be sometime this year, but a couple months away. Let's put that on our timeline. Sometime after that, probably shortly after that, we have the beginning of sacrifices on the Temple Mount. We'll add that to the timeline too, because they're going to be important in that Gog of Magog invasion. And then we have the start of the Gog of Magog invasion at the midpoint, and then Armageddon at the completion, which is the end of the Gog of Magog war and the end of the 70th week. So that leaves approximately a 2.5-year period from the two-state solution and the making of a false peace covenant until the invasion of Israel at the midpoint. This is what we're proposing as the period of false peace, and really is the focus of today's teaching. Questions we have to answer today are: what makes Israel move from its current situation of being a nation under siege to a nation of unwalled villages? How is that going to happen? Then also, what causes Gog of Magog to invade at the midpoint? These are two huge questions that we need to answer. So if Israel signs a treaty where they divide their land in exchange for peace, maybe in the next 6 to 8 months, how long will it take before they trust their neighbors enough to the extent that they become a nation dwelling securely? What factors then could accelerate this release of tension? The way I see it, the number one factor would be some kind of robust international guarantee and monitoring. Maybe the United Nations placing a peacekeeping force in the land formerly occupied by the Hammis and all along the borders of Israel. Israelis then might begin to feel safer. And if no incidents happened for those 2.5 years, well, I could see the tension in the region dramatically dissipating, because that's something different than happens in most conflicts. A second major factor would be if their former foes began to fight against themselves and no longer seemed interested or concentrating on Israel. Daniel 8:1-8 predicts a future war that will take place in the first half of the tribulation, in which Turkey defeats Iran. Imagine how that would impact Israeli tensions. It would certainly decrease them dramatically. However, unknown to the world, Daniel 8 through 9 tells us that that war that's coming will also lead to the rise of the Antichrist. A third major factor would be if the Israelis are once again allowed free access to the Temple Mount. If sacrifices and offerings are once again allowed, and we know that they will be from the Bible, and some sort of accommodation for a temple is made, either the construction of a temple or shared use of the Dome of the Rock, or even an allowance for setting up a tabernacle tent, these things happen without any violent incidents. Israel will really let down their guard and say, hey, maybe this peace treaty worked. But we know that prophecy dictates that a major surprise invasion happens at the midpoint of the tribulation, an invasion that the Antichrist himself leads right into Jerusalem. Why will the Gog-Magog coalition want to invade? All the nations listed in Ezekiel 38 are currently Muslim nations. Although they're joined by other nations, the issue is probably a religious one. The daily sacrifices from the Jews are going to be offensive to Muslims because they will take place on what they deem to be their Temple Mount. Plus, they believe the black stone of the Kaaba takes away their sin. Just like the 2023 Middle East war was said to be launched by the Hammis to free the Temple Mount, the Gog of Magog war will really be for that purpose. However, this will be a surprise invasion, so that the former animosities between Israel and her neighbors have to go underground and be suppressed until that time. I imagine that is possible if an alliance of leaders forms behind closed doors. Think about what the Bible says. The 10 kings of the beast are just such an alliance. We learn in Psalm 83, 3 through 5, that the 10 people groups that surround Israel do this. They lay crafty plans against your people. They consult together against your treasured ones. They say, come, let us wipe them out as a nation. Let the name of Israel be remembered no more. For they conspire with one accord against you, and they make a covenant. Yeah, that seems to match what we're considering. What sets them off, however, seems to be the Antichrist's rising. Remember, we mentioned Daniel 8 describes a scenario where a coalition of Sunni nations, led by Turkey, eventually defeat Iran. Someone, likely the UN, seems to step in at this point and splits up the coalition into a group of 4 new nations. And out of one of these, the Antichrist arises. And from Revelation 17:17, we learn the 10 kings give their power and authority to this beast. The Bible doesn't provide all the details, but to me, the Antichrist rising is related to the retaking of Jerusalem. He is able to organize all the dissatisfied factions in the Middle East and North Africa who are frustrated by losing their exclusive right to the Temple Mount and the splitting of the Sunni coalition into 4 nations by the UN, and they funnel all this frustration into getting behind this charismatic leader. And the UN forces, are they just going to lay down and allow this leader to invade Jerusalem? They probably won't just lay down. They'll probably join him. Think about the UN. Think about all the anti-Jew sentiment that is worldwide right now. All get funneled right to that Antichrist figure. They'll turn their guns around, join him, and be part of the invasion, in our opinion. You may say, I don't know about this Daniel 8 prophecy. Well, then click right here and discover what God says must happen at the time of the end, and how the Antichrist arises out of the war between Sunni and Shia Muslims. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there for that important episode.